The modern American's moral imagination is profoundly shaped by two things: slavery and the Holocaust. It's been said that Hitler has become the post-war devil, and the idea that slavery is wrong is one of the most foundational moral maxims of our time. And just for the record, in case you're holding your breath, I'll say at the very beginning, slavery is wrong. Feel free to exhale. In any case, during the last century or so, in which Americans disagreed on a host of moral issues, these two have remained fairly constant. Simultaneously, it's an almost equally basic law of attention that if you say things people find outrageous, you will get outrageous levels of attention and engagement. And in an economy wherein attention can be monetized, we find ourselves in a position where people are incentivized to spark outrage. And perhaps that explains in part why there has been a recent wave of Christian nationalists defending slavery. A few weeks ago, Joshua Haymes, a self-proclaimed Christian nationalist, former pastor, and the host of the Reformation Red Pill podcast, made headlines for saying that slavery is not inherently evil and that every Christian should be able to defend it. More recently, Doug Wilson, perhaps the most famous American Christian nationalist and someone with whom Haymes is affiliated, went on Sam Harris's podcast and applauded Harris for understanding the Bible better than most evangelicals when Sam said that the Bible defends the practice of slavery. While Wilson said that he personally was glad that our country has put the question of slavery behind us and that he thinks the New Testament sowed the seeds for the undermining of slavery, he is committed to the notion that slavery is not inherently evil in all its forms. So, what's going on? Is this just clickbait theology? Is this nothing but a grasping for attention from Christian nationalists under the motto that, hey, all press is good press? Maybe. But at least in some cases, I think there's more going on here. In fact, I think this sheds light on a deep tension in Christian theology that most Christians have wanted to avoid. The question of Christianity's relationship to slavery is one that's highly contentious. Alex O'Connor went viral, as he's quite apt to do, by getting a Catholic AI apologist tied up in knots when it was forced to acknowledge three things. 1, God as a morally perfect being would not condone inherently immoral actions. 2, slavery is inherently immoral. And 3, God condoned slavery. This, at least on the surface, appears to be a blatant contradiction, and Alex does a good job of pressing in on it in what's a pretty entertaining video, I must admit. It's also not an unfamiliar dilemma for Christians, albeit usually it's humans, not AI apologists, in the hot seat. For the past 150 years or so since the abolition movement, Christians have been wrestling with this tension. And to get out of this bind, Christians must disagree with one of the three premises. And predominantly, the method has been to quibble with premise 1 or premise 3, but definitely not premise 2, seeing as, well, we all agree that slavery is immoral. Before we see how Christians get out of this particular bind, let me help you get out of a different situation: getting ad interruptions in my videos. Did you know that my patrons get early ad-free access to all my videos? For as little as $7 per month, you can join to support the channel, get access to my book club, and not have to sit through ad breaks. And even more than that, it really does help this channel. It supports me and my wife, and it means the world to me. So if you want to do that, you can go to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. Let's start with premise 1. The first half, that God is a morally perfect being, is something that no Orthodox Christian really denies. Whether it's grounded exegetically in the idea that God is love, or philosophically in the requirement that a necessary being be perfect, Christians and classical theists generally want to keep that part of the premise. There is, however, a question of whether a morally perfect being must not, by virtue of being perfect, condone inherently immoral actions. Here we have what we could call a greater good defense. Basically, the idea is that a morally perfect being could condone an immoral action if and only if that immoral action led to a greater moral good or to restrain a greater harm. So if we apply this to slavery, the basic argument would be that God permitted certain forms of slavery in past times, not as an eternal moral ideal, but as a concession within a brutal ancient world to restrict even worse harms rather than endorsing the morality of slavery itself. Basically, God was meeting people where they were and triaging the situation. If we look at premise 3, we find some Christians simply deny that God condoned slavery at all. There are a few ways of doing this. First, I'll be honest, there are those who, at a popular and perhaps innocent level, just think that there's no way the Bible does such a thing. Often, though, this comes from unfamiliarity with the Old Testament's actual laws. Second, there are those who are familiar with the Old Testament, but think it doesn't represent God's will. In more theologically liberal circles, people might be comfortable saying, look, those laws are just the product of human writers, not God's actual will for humanity. For many Christians, though, getting God off the hook for slavery at the cost of biblical inspiration is just not a path they're willing to take. A third approach is to argue that biblical slavery was different from the race-based chattel slavery of the modern era. And look, there is truth to that. Slavery has taken many forms, and there's even different forms within the Bible. But when people today call slavery immoral, they typically are referring to any situation in which one human being owns another, and they're saying all of those are immoral. And under that definition, distinctions between ancient Near Eastern and 19th century American contexts, they don't fully remove the tension. The final way of arguing against premise 3 is probably the most common Christian response to arguments about slavery, and that is to appeal to an idea known as progressive revelation. Basically, the idea of progressive revelation is that God reveals himself more fully over time. This allows one to say that in the Old Testament, God might have conditionally allowed slavery, but as time went on, he was always moving his people in a trajectory toward liberation, and thus the ultimate vision of the Bible is for the abolition of slavery. And I want to point out, this isn't some random theologically liberal idea that pops up late in the church's life. You can see traces of this kind of notion of God's progressive revelation and accommodation to culture throughout Christian history. And in fact, a lot of the early church fathers read much or all of the Old Testament allegorically in ways that would seem much more scandalous to a lot of Christians today. And certainly they might even see some of this as more theologically conservative. So this isn't just this ad hoc thing. But people who are skeptical of this argument will point out that the New Testament doesn't explicitly reject slavery. And if anything, it seems to assume its continuation by commenting on master-slave relations. However, proponents of the progressive revelation view will say that even this was temporary and that it showed some progress, and the more fundamental message of the gospel is one of equality, freedom, and that those seeds, when fully grown, sprout into the trees of abolitionism. To strengthen this case, they'll point to the fact that many of the most prominent abolitionists were Christians and received their motivation for the cause of abolition from the message of the gospel. From what I can tell, this was pretty much the stalemate that Christians and skeptics had reached for some time now. While it certainly didn't convince all skeptics, it proved itself to be a firm enough foundation for Christians to carry on. But recently, it seems things are changing, and Christians are going back to the drawing board. Or, I should be clear, some fringe Christians are going back to the drawing board. Why is that? Well, lucky for us, we don't necessarily have to guess. Doug Wilson himself has outlined why it's necessary for Christians to change their approach. For him, it all comes down to homosexuality. And for those who are new to these discussions, that might seem completely out of left field. What do slavery and homosexuality have to do with each other? Well, it all comes down to hermeneutics, which is to say, it's a question of how we ought to interpret the Bible. Wilson, in a video with Jeff Durbin from Apologia Studios, said that in any debate Christians are having about homosexuality or LGBTQ+ issues, the questions of slavery inevitably rear their head. The argument is that, essentially, the Bible seems equally clear on the idea that homosexuality is wrong and slavery is okay. And yet, Christians have found a way to get around this seemingly clear approval of slavery by appealing to more fundamental principles like the image of God, equality, and liberation. So the question becomes, why can't they do the same with homosexuality? Thus, for Wilson, this way of interpreting the Bible seems like something of a slippery slope. And so rather than accept that idea, he and others are going back to that initial conundrum and saying that the solution is for Christians to go with the culturally nuclear option. Deny premise 2 from our initial conundrum and just say that slavery isn't inherently evil. In the name of what Wilson calls biblical absolutism, these figures want to not give any ground to ideas that contradict Scripture. And for them, it means they must defend even the most difficult parts of Scripture. And look, at one level, defending the Bible isn't something that is unique to Christian nationalists. Again, for decades, Christians have been defending the Bible by appealing to progressive revelation. they could have their cake and eat it too, in the sense that they could disavow slavery and defend the Bible. And I still think you can do that. But now that people are taking their method of interpretation based on broad principles and using it to justify other things, like homosexuality, that they're less comfortable with, well, things are beginning to change. And thus, in the name of not losing the debate over LGBTQ issues, some Christians, again, very few, but some, are willing to swallow the very bitter pill of affirming slavery. So that's the story of how we've gotten here. And in many ways, it's not a new story. If you want to go deep on the topic of the Bible and slavery, Mark Knoll, one of the greatest kind of church historians in America, has written a fascinating book, The Civil War as Theological Crisis, exploring how debates over how to read the Bible flared during that rather tumultuous period, to put it lightly. Then, as now, some Christians felt that to disavow slavery was to open the door to theological liberalism. Presbyterian minister Henry Van Dyke famously said that abolitionism springs from and is nourished by an utter rejection of Scripture. For him, the Bible was clear. Slavery had divine approval. For abolitionists, the Bible was equally clear. Henry Ward Beecher claimed that if people only read the Bible without hindrance, they'd soon come to see that the message of Scripture is fundamentally opposed to slavery. For the most part, Beecher's view seems to have won the day. And yet, fringes of the Christian Nationalist movement today are bringing us right back to the 19th century. And while the debates today are mainly the musings of podcasters with a lot of time on their hands and a propensity for controversy, they signal deep troubles in modern Protestant theology. First, there's the issue of perspicuity. Namely, is the Bible clear on these issues? From our vantage, it has been easy to say, yes, the Bible is clear on this, and we can simply retort that those who disagreed or thought otherwise were just blinded by their times. But now, Wilson and others are saying the inverse. If you think slavery is wrong, that's because of your culture, not the clear teaching of the Bible. Second, there's the question of hermeneutics. Is the Bible fundamentally a repository of static truths, or is it a narrative that must be read as one grand story? If so, is that story as yet unfinished? Here's what I mean. Like slavery, could something be allowed to continue during the portions of that story recorded in the text that we call the Bible, but be on a path that continues beyond the final pages? A lot hangs in the balance here. If so, as it seems many Christians want to say, at least with slavery, the real task of theology then becomes discerning the trajectories that are on course from those that are veering off course. Anglican bishop and theologian N.T. Wright has described Christian theology as something like a 4-part play in which the Bible gives us the first 3 parts, and it's our job to faithfully act out that 4th part based on those 3 parts. That's another way of getting at this image of a trajectory that could start in Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3 that we then got to figure out what to do in Act 4. But the inverse would be to say that the Bible is like a law code, and whatever it said in Part 1 is equally applicable in Part 4, in Part 2, and Part 3, all the same, rather than one story that's leading in a direction. Look, before we close, though, let me be clear about one thing. Wilson, Haymes, and others do not represent mainstream Christianity, mainstream Protestantism, or even just Reformed theology. They're making headlines precisely because what they say is so different from what most Christians believe. I don't bring them up to legitimize their views. I bring them up because whether you like it or not, they're growing in popularity. What seems like niche internet debates today will be debates in church pews tomorrow, and if Wilson's interview with Harris or his connections with Pete Hegseth are any indication, these debates might not be going away. So, strange as it may seem, Christians might find themselves having to explain once again, not just to skeptics, but to other Christians, that slavery is, in fact, wrong.